I'm very glad to be able to tell you about my book, This America of Ours, Bernard and Avis DeVoto and the Forgotten Fight to Save the Wild. A quick pronunciation note. The DeVotos have one son who is still alive. Mark DeVoto just turned 84 years old. I interviewed him a number of times. He was very helpful. He let me know that his dad pronounced his name not Bernard, but Bernard, the English pronunciation. So you'll hear me say it like that. By a show of hands, just out of curiosity, how many of you have ever heard of Bernard DeVoto? All right, wonderful. That's more than I often see. I'm gratified about that. What about his wife, Avis DeVoto, who's a little bit more prominent in pop culture these days? Anyone familiar with Avis? Well, hopefully, when I'm done talking in a little less than an hour, there will be a couple more devotees here. I am not proud to admit this, but despite having been born and raised in Missoula, Montana, which is about an hour and a half from this, I did not know who the DeVotos were until I found a Bernard DeVoto book in the Strand bookstore in New York City, where I now live and work as a freelance journalist. This is the DeVoto Memorial Cedar Grove. It is on top of the Bitterroot Mountains. It is near the border of Idaho and Montana. It is inside the Clearwater National Forest, which is part of America's incredible suite of wild public lands, lands that belong to all of us, the most prominent of which are our national parks. This talk that I'm going to give with, I swear, a minimum of spoilers, it's a love story. It's also a story about the McCarthy era and McCarthyism, and above all, it's a story about public lands conservation. I'm going to tell you why the DeVotos are so honored on our public lands, for the role that they played in the McCarthy era to help protect and defend our public lands. This grainy 1954 video shows Bernard DeVoto pointing at what started his interest in conservation. That is his maternal grandfather's farm at the base of the Wasatch Mountains near Ogden, Utah. That's where Bernard DeVoto was born in 1897. He was such an adorable kid that family lore has it that he won a beauty contest. Those days were numbered. This is his mother, Rhoda. She is born in Utah into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. She falls away from it, becoming what I heard growing up colloquially referred to as a Jack Mormon. But it is her father, Samuel, who brings that branch of the DeVoto family tree to North America. Samuel immigrates from drizzly England to desert Utah in the 1850s when he converts to Mormonism, and he becomes a farmer, which was incredibly difficult. And sometimes people in the East who know that I'm from the West, sometimes people will ask me, what is the deal with public lands? Why are there so many? Why are there different designations? Are they just scenery? Are they just federal tyranny? And the simplest answer that I can give to that complex question is the same one-word answer that Bernard DeVoto's grandpa figured out, which is the same answer that the ancestral Puebloans who lived and farmed in the American Southwest 1,000 years earlier figured out. The answer is water. Because unlike the humid eastern half of the United States, unlike drizzly England, where enough precipitation to support a family farm falls from the sky in the form of rain across vast expanses of the U.S. West, most of the precipitation catches as wintertime snow on the tops of high mountains. And the key to survival in the West is getting that snow melt, that water, down from the tops of those mountains into the valleys below, because that's where the towns and farms and cities and ranches are, sometimes multiple states away. And for that process to happen, you have to have healthy forests and healthy grasslands. And so at the turn of the 20th century, Theodore Roosevelt, our first great conservation president, he created around 150 national forests, mostly in the West, to protect those water supplies, including the Wasatch National Forest above Ogden. And that made a profound impact on young Bernard DeVoto, because one of his chores growing up was helping to irrigate his grandpa's farm. Though Bernard DeVoto loved the West, loved its people, its history, its scenery, in 1915 he relocated to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and he enrolled at Harvard University. When World War I came, he enlisted in the Army. You can see in this photo of him in uniform that his nose is now flat. He tried playing baseball as a boy, and he got his nose shattered by a bat. His days of winning beauty contests were behind him. But while he was not aesthetically blessed, while he was not athletically gifted, he was incredibly, almost frighteningly smart, and he really thrived at Harvard. And he realized how smart he was. When he was in his early 20s, he wrote, quote, "My mind is as good as there is." So you can see he was humble, too. But while his mind was as good as could be, his heart wasn't. Not until in 1922 he met the love of his life, Helen Avis McVicker. Avis DeVoto was born on the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. She grew up surrounded on three sides by Lake Superior. Avis was also incredibly smart. Like Bernard DeVoto, she had a great wit. She had very strong opinions. She was also very vivacious, very personable. Avis was very stylish and very fashionable. And one thing to know about Avis DeVoto, she was fearless. She was absolutely daring. And Avis and Bernard were attracted to each other because they shared a love of books. But it wasn't just the way that they were alike that made them work so well. It was also the ways that they were opposite but complementary. Bernard loved to write. Avis loved to edit. Bernard loved attention. Avis cherished her privacy. Bernard loved to eat. Avis DeVoto loved to cook. All her life, she was fascinated with food and with cooking. Remember that. This is the first photograph of the DeVotos together. This is them on their honeymoon in 1923. But Avis could never truly know her husband until she knew where he came from, the U.S. West. And so in 1925, they rode a train to Ogden, Utah, and Bernard introduced Avis to her father-in-law, Florian DeVoto. He had come west on the Transcontinental Railroad. He stayed in Ogden to work as a land title specialist. And while the DeVotos were in town, Bernard wanted to show Avis what in his youth had been a paradise, the Wasatch National Forest. So they rented a little cabin in a high mountain valley. And when they got there, they were aghast at what they saw, because in order to boost lumber production in World War I, logging regulations were lifted. And in order to boost beef and wool production in World War I, grazing regulations were lifted, but then never put back in place in peacetime. And when the DeVotos were up in this denuded landscape, a rainstorm hit and a flash flood came at them that almost killed them. The DeVotos made out a lot better than a lot of Westerners in the 1920s because flash floods devastated towns and cities all throughout the region. Pueblo, Colorado, Escalante, Utah, Silver City, New Mexico, always for the same reason, because of conservation failures. Been grazed almost to extinction was the post-mortem. So while it was working on his grandpa's farm that gave Bernard DeVoto an appreciation for public lands, it was these deadly floods of the 1920s that made him understand the imperative of protecting public lands. And that passion, which both DeVotos shared for the rest of their lives, it pitted them against their great nemesis, Nevada Senator Pat McCarron. If any of you have seen The Godfather Part 2, it opens up at Lake Tahoe with mobster Michael Corleone being shaken down for a bribe by corrupt Nevada Senator Pat Geary, who is the on-screen representation of real-life corrupt Nevada Senator Pat McCarron. Senator McCarron is another forgotten figure, and he shouldn't be, because in our history, there has rarely been another politician so powerful, paranoid, vengeful, bigoted, corrupt, and absolutely genius as Pat McCarron. Early Nevada was so corrupt, its nickname was the Rotten Borough. And Democratic Senator McCarron embodied that corruption. He cultivated a constituency that lived in mansions at Lake Tahoe and owned ginormous ranches in the desert. And on behalf of this acquisitive constituency, Pat McCarron went to war against a conservation agency that Franklin Roosevelt created to help fight the Dust Bowl. The Roaring Twenties in America were followed by the Dirty Thirties. And to protect the long-rooted native grasses that held Western soil in place, Franklin Roosevelt created an agency called the Grazing Service. It was to do for grass what his cousin Theodore Roosevelt's Forest Service did for trees. The Grazing Service was tasked with protecting the West's grasslands and prairies and deserts and canyon country. And Pat McCarron went to war against the Grazing Service. And he did it in a very manipulative and duplicitous way. He announced he would hold a series of open public meetings all across the West where any citizen could come and voice concerns about public lands. But secretly, McCarron stage managed these meetings. And he gave the best speaking times, and he allowed the topics discussed to be dictated by only the voices he wanted to hear from, which were the West's biggest cattle ranchers and biggest sheep barons. And everybody else got their voices diminished and dismissed. And this was a plurality of Westerners. These were small ranchers, Native Americans, hunters, hikers, anglers, wildlife lovers, trade unionists, municipal water suppliers, irrigation farmers. It would have included the DeVotos, but in the 1930s, the DeVotos put down roots far from the West. They settled in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and this is the decade when the DeVoto literary star takes off. In 1935, Bernard DeVoto is given the honor of writing the monthly Easy Chair column in Harper's Magazine. It's the oldest feature in American journalism. Writing this monthly column gave Bernard DeVoto a national platform. It gave him gravitas. It gave him an outlet for his increasingly pointed and sometimes controversial opinions on subjects like public lands conservation. Harper's didn't pay much money, so to subsidize his work, Bernard DeVoto wrote serialized fiction for big glossy magazines like the Saturday Evening Post. These were like the Netflix series of that era. And with stories going out and money coming in, the DeVotos began to live a very sort of glamorous and glitzy lifestyle. They threw magnificent parties, and if you look at Avis on the side of this series of photos, you can see her reaction to some of the shenanigans that went on at these parties. Their newfound literary fame brought new friends into their lives, like the novelist Sinclair Lewis, and this is Bernard DeVoto with the poet Archibald MacLeish, the novelist Ralph Ellison. This is Avis with the great poet Robert Frost. But while the DeVotos appeared to be living a very successful and happy and wealthy life, that really masked the fact that they were going through some intense private and personal turmoil. Robert Frost, pictured here eating wild berries with Avis and appearing to admire her, he tried to come between the DeVotos. And at the same time, Bernard DeVoto began a relationship with this young woman, Catherine Stern. It was never a physical relationship. Kate Stern was an art critic for the New York Times, and in her mid-20s, she came down with tuberculosis. And she spent the rest of her relatively short life inside of an iron lung. And from there, she wrote Bernard DeVoto a fan letter. And though they never met in person over the span of more than a decade, they swapped hundreds and hundreds of intimate letters. And Avis knew about this, and she was okay with it because she was all right with anything that Bernard did to regulate his mood because she knew the private hell that he was going through. Part of the reason DeVoto was going through hell is he wanted to write the great American novel, and he dreamed of being a great novelist. And he did write novels, and they were lousy. and they didn't sell well, and they got mixed reviews, and he had to accept that he didn't have a great novel in him. He was also the type of person constitutionally who wasn't really at home anywhere. Growing up in Utah, he was too fascinated with what might be happening in intellectual capitals like Harvard to fit in. When he was finally at Harvard, he was too obsessed with Western U.S. history to really fit in. And nowhere was Bernard DeVoto more of an iconoclast, more of a maverick than politically. In the 1930s, the nation swung far to the left because of the Great Depression and the stock market crash. And within the realm of academia and literature, more than a few people looked to relatively young Soviet Russia as a model utopia that the United States should either emulate or, if need be, submit to. And within his realm, nobody more loudly and rudely than Bernard DeVoto said that anybody who thought that was an idiot. Bernard DeVoto wrote that anybody who thought that communism was viable, anybody who thought that Karl Marx was particularly smart, was suffering from a, quote, imbecile delusion. And so in the 1930s, people called Bernard DeVoto a fascist. And so it was that combination of things. It was that always putting intense pressure on himself, that never really being at home anywhere, and that absolute commitment to his own free thinking, no matter the consequences. That put a heavy psychic strain on Bernard DeVoto, and he went through some suicidal depressions. Fortunately, Avis provided the emotional stability and support to get him through, and come the 1940s, they had started a family. They had 2 sons, Gordon and Mark, and this is the decade when the DeVoto literary star reaches its height. Bernard DeVoto will write a trilogy of Western history that will win numerous major awards. It will cement his literary legacy. Bernard DeVoto finds his true voice writing nonfiction about the West, and the first book in this great trilogy is The Year of Decision, 1846. In cinematic prose, Bernard DeVoto writes about the grit of soldiers in the Mexican-American War and the ordeal of Mormons who flee persecution and look for religious freedom in the deserts of what will become Utah. He writes about the Donner Party who get stuck atop the Sierra Nevada mountains in winter and survive by cannibalism. This book comes out at the low point of World War II, and it's seen as an allegory for what U.S. soldiers are going through, fighting Imperial Japan and Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. And because this book so inspires U.S. soldiers, it becomes a surprise smash hit. DeVoto's next book works back in time to the heyday of the Rocky Mountain fur trade in the 1820s. Across the wide Missouri, which tells the story of the mountain men, it wins the Pulitzer Prize. DeVoto's next book, The Course of Empire, which wins the National Book Award, it works even farther back in Western history, and because of that, it features 2 characters who DeVoto affectionately refers to as, quote, my boys, unquote. Lewis and Clark. Bernard DeVoto wrote so expertly and evocatively about the explorers Lewis and Clark that he would get fan mail like this from some Boy Scouts in Long Island. And these scouts have drawn letterhead with elaborate scenes from the Lewis and Clark expedition, and they've drawn a map of the Lewis and Clark Trail. And these scouts begged DeVoto, take us with you. Guide us along the Lewis and Clark Trail, because come the end of the war, 1946, that is exactly what Bernard DeVoto intended to do. He was going to take Avis and their boys on the research trip of a lifetime. They were going to drive from Massachusetts to the Pacific Ocean, following the Lewis and Clark Trail and visiting national parks and public lands all along the way. And Bernard DeVoto intended to write at least 1 column about conservation for Harper's Magazine from this. And based on what he had followed in the 1930s with the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, and the good work it had done in the West, he expected this was going to be a hopeful column. And when the DeVotos went west for research, as they did a number of times, they really did it up. They wanted to talk to everybody they possibly could. They wanted to learn everything they could. Bernard would go out hiking with Forest Service officials to learn the ecosystems, the plants, the animals. Avis would befriend Forest Service rangers. They would see the scenic sights. This is Avis and her son Gordon posed in front of a geyser in Yellowstone Park. This is Avis and Gordon riding on a ski lift to the top of a mountain in the Colorado Rockies to get a panoramic vista. Bernard DeVoto was too afraid of heights to join them. But he would go out flying around with smoke jumpers who took off in little planes from Missoula, Montana. They would get out on the water. Bernard would float down the Missouri River with the great Montana novelist Bud Guthrie Jr. like they were characters in a Mark Twain story. This is Avis looking typically fashionable in the middle of Jenny Lake in Grand Teton National Park. But one thing Bernard DeVoto would always do is he would drop down on his hands and knees and he would check out the grass because he wanted to see if the ranges were being overgrazed. And the answer to that question after 1946 was yes, because of Nevada Senator Pat McCarron. With the world distracted by war, those McCarron public land hearings escalated, and they took on a sadistic twist. McCarron began to order employees of the Grazing Service and the Forest Service and the Park Service to attend his hearings, and he would forbid them to speak while he invited his hand-selected audience members to shout insults at them. A McCarron aide said the purpose of this was to affect these conservation professionals, quote, psychologically, unquote. And so during the war, McCarron went from just amplifying the voices of people he wanted to hear from, the West's biggest cattle ranchers and biggest sheep barons, and diminishing and dismissing the people who dissented from them. He went to starting to demonize his dissenters. McCarron, in the mid-1940s, began to claim that America was being filled up with communists, and that these communists were out to destroy America from within, and that he, Pat McCarron, was going to stop them and to save America. And McCarron gathered thousands of pages of testimony in his hearings that was cooked before it was collected, and he used that as justification to flex his power on Senate appropriations committees, and he slashed the budget of the Grazing Service, this conservation agency that FDR created to fight the Dust Bowl. McCarron slashed its budget so deeply that it could not recover. Because McCarron so defunded it, the new president, Harry Truman, took what was left of the Grazing Service and he combined it with the moribund and historically corrupt General Land Office to create a new and enfeebled conservation agency, the Bureau of Land Management. This is the birth of the BLM, the first BLM. It should have been called the Bureau of Pat McCarron. The environmental writer Edward Abbey would soon call the BLM the Bureau of Livestock and Mining, which is exactly what McCarron wanted. The DeVotos go west in June 1946, the same month that the BLM is born. They leave in their 6-year-old Buick stuffed with all the supplies they're going to need for 3 months, and they don't yet realize the ramifications of what had happened. And when they first got to the west, they were having a magnificent time. They were buying souvenirs and stopping at roadside historical markers and posing for family photos and seeing the scenery. But what they saw turned tragic when they reached the Dakotas and they saw the beginnings of the Garrison Dam across the Missouri River. The Garrison Dam was going to create a reservoir that would flood out some 150,000 acres of the homelands of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara nations, all without permission from those nations. This painful photograph shows the signing that officially authorized, quote unquote, the already under construction Garrison Dam, the gentleman weeping as the sole representative from those tribal nations. When the DeVotos see scenes like this, they can't believe their eyes. They thought scenes like this were something out of the 1800s, not something out of the mid-1900s. And the DeVotos know from their deep study of American history that the biggest public land scams, the biggest public domain frauds went hand in hand with this kind of mass native dispossession because the common denominator is greed. It's natural resource plundering, natural resource looting. Bernard DeVoto can chart the entire history of the West through a series of natural resource raids for fur, gold, grass, timber, oil, water, and the land itself. The DeVotos know that if they're seeing things like this in Indian country, they need to have their eyes and ears open in case there's an even bigger raid on public resources, on federally protected lands being cooked up and kept in secret, some kind of plot that might go back to Nevada Senator Pat McCarron, seen here on a reservoir catching a bass. Continuing on the Lewis and Clark Trail, the DeVotos get to the eastern Montana ranching community of Miles City, and they go to the Range Riders Cafe. Because remember, DeVoto loves to eat, and he knows that the Range Riders Cafe serves the best steak in America. He will crow to his readers on the eastern seaboard that for no amount of money in their time zone could they get a steak anywhere near as good as the one he can get for $1.50 at the Range Riders. But while they're in there, they eavesdrop, and they overhear a, quote, very loud, very drunk cattleman, unquote, give them a tip. The tip is that their hunch is correct. There is a bigger raid on federal lands being cooked up and kept in secret in the West. And at this juncture, the DeVotos transform into investigative journalists. And they decide that if they can somehow get the exact details of this plot they overhear cowboys talking about in the Range Riders Cafe, they can put it in Harper's Magazine. Maybe they can stop it from happening. And so their National Park Lewis and Clark adventure turns into a networking odyssey. And they go across the West meeting with sources. In Great Falls, Montana, they meet with newspaperman Joseph Kinsey Howard, who is rightfully in the Montana Journalism Hall of Fame. He wrote one of the best books about the state, Montana, High, Wide, and Handsome. In Yosemite National Park in California, they met with their mutual friend Ansel Adams, the landscape photographer. They asked what he knew about this plot. In Jackson Hole, Wyoming, they met with writer Struthers Burt, a member of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, a mole on the inside for Bernard DeVoto. They also met with their mutual friend Wallace Stegner, the great novelist whose career Bernard DeVoto helped launch by writing rave reviews of his work. But they got their big break in Ogden, Utah, when they met with this gentleman, Chet Olson, a Forest Service official. Through the 1930s, Chet Olson led hundreds of CCC workers up into the Wasatch Mountains, and they replanted trees, and they replanted grass, and they stopped those deadly floods. And Chet Olson knew something. He knew that in August 1946 in Salt Lake City, there was going to be a meeting of some of the West's biggest cattle ranchers and biggest sheep barons, and that a select group of them were going to break off and meet in private, and they were going to hash out a legislative agenda. And that legislative agenda would have all the details that the DeVotos had been searching for, from the Dakotas through Montana and Idaho and Washington and Oregon and California and Nevada and Utah and Wyoming and Colorado. Everything was going to be revealed at that meeting. And of course, presiding over this entire meeting is Nevada Senator Pat McCarron. Somehow, Chet Olson of the U.S. Forest Service got a transcript of that secret meeting into Bernard DeVoto's hands, and what he read set his stubby hair on fire. The plot was this: to take every acre under the new and enfeebled Bureau of Land Management, transfer them to states, and sell them off, and then have McCarron-approved survey crews go into national forests, national monuments, and national parks, and transfer out an additional perhaps 80 million more acres. All told, the amount of acreage at stake was 230 million. This calico-looking map that shows, that Westerners show what was at stake. The yellow is BLM land, the light green is Forest Service land, the salmon color is Indian country, the dark green is national park land. Bernard DeVoto calls this a land grab. And he writes, Senator McCarron has been the ablest representative of cattle and sheep interests in Washington against the West and the people of the United States. And he puts that in the January 1947 issue of Harper's Magazine in a blockbuster double-length article he titles The West Against Itself, that being a reference to politicians like McCarron who for political gain and quick cash would liquidate the natural resources of the West, which is to say the future of the West. And DeVoto spells out this complex plot in very simple terms. The plan is to get rid of public lands altogether, turning them over to the states which can be coerced as the federal government cannot be, and eventually to private ownership. This is your land we are talking about. Incidentally, DeVoto writes this just a few years after Woody Guthrie has written This Land Is Your Land, but before that song became a classic. That article, The West Against Itself, it does everything that the DeVotos want. Bernard DeVoto remembers later that it, quote, fused an explosion, unquote. It rendered that land grab suite of legislation too radioactive for any member of Congress to touch, even Senator McCarron. The DeVotos saved as many as 230 million acres of America's public lands in the 1940s. But as the 1940s turned into the 1950s, a very powerful new ally came to the aid of Senator Pat McCarron, or rather, somebody who had been a nobody in politics turned himself into the most prominent person in politics by starting to mimic Pat McCarron, like a character actor stepping into a role. You'll notice that when Pat McCarron gets fan mail, it comes with stickers on it that say, I'm for McCarthy. And he gets incredible letterhead like this with heroically drawn pictures of Joe McCarthy that says, McCarthyism is Americanism, and I like McCarthy and his methods. Where did Joe McCarthy get those methods of smearing innocent Americans and claiming that they're communists? From Pat McCarron. Remember, Pat McCarron was doing that in the 1940s with his public lands hearings, and only when Joe McCarthy started to say the same thing in 1950, it went that era's version of viral. And McCarron and McCarthy became something of a partnership team because each one had something that the other did not. Joe McCarthy had a genius for attracting attention and getting publicity. This is why we talk about the McCarthy era and McCarthyism rather than what we should talk about, which is the McCarron era and McCarronism. But it was Pat McCarron that passed all the actual laws that codify McCarthyism. And some of these laws are the most oppressive in American history. Pat McCarron legalized concentration camps in America. The key to understanding McCarthyism is to understand Pat McCarron. If you wanted to know what was going to come out of the mouth of young Republican Joe McCarthy, you needed to only have looked at what had just come out of the mouth of old Democrat Pat McCarron. And Joe McCarthy's innovation was rhetorical. It was a way of speaking. It was the art of the smear. It was a way of making innocent people sound dangerous through suggestion and innuendo and inference and allusion. And some of Pat McCarron's allies in the West began to pick up on that McCarthyist way of speaking, that way of achieving a dramatic effect while eliding responsibility. One of them was a gentleman named J. Elmer Brock, a president of the powerful Wyoming Stock Growers Association. After Bernard DeVoto exposed and thwarted the land grab, Brock decided to inform on Bernard DeVoto to J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI. Brock did it on his livestock company stationery. And Brock told Hoover, as far as the sentiments of the stockmen in the West, we would like to see Bernard hanging from a cottonwood limb. And maybe that's fine, maybe that's just a guy blowing off some steam, except that Brock included in his parcel to Hoover an article that the Wyoming stock growers had published in their own magazine, which asked whether America might be better if DeVoto just moved to Russia, or whether he ought to have a hammer and sickle over his desk. This is from Bernard DeVoto's FBI file. You can see that the hammer and sickle line is underlined and a black arrow points to it. Now, if the Wyoming stock growers had written, quote, DeVoto is a communist, unquote, DeVoto could sue them for libel. But if they just ask whether he ought to move to Russia or maybe have a hammer and sickle over his desk, they achieve that dramatic effect while eliding responsibility. That's the essence of McCarthyism. And that McCarthyist way of talking was of grave concern to Bernard DeVoto, pictured here at his desk with neither a hammer nor a sickle over it. He thought it was a threat to the Bill of Rights because it jeopardized people's right to due process. And so in late 1949, Bernard DeVoto wrote the most controversial column of his career, "Due Notice to the FBI." This is one of the first articles in a national magazine to criticize Joe McCarthy, but more so, it takes the FBI to task for collecting McCarthyist slander and gossip and rumors and innuendo. Around the time that this article came out, a Gallup poll showed that 78% of Americans thought the FBI was doing a good job versus only 2% who didn't. That's incredible to think of in our year 2024. This article shows Bernard DeVoto at his most free-thinking, his most maverick, his most courageous. And when it appeared, J. Edgar Hoover was furious. J. Edgar Hoover sent memos to every single FBI headquarters in all 48 states and 3 territories warning about Bernard DeVoto. The FBI began to track people who read books by Bernard DeVoto. Joe McCarthy started to try to ban books by Bernard DeVoto. And Hoover launched an investigation into a question that was really bothering him. Had Bernard DeVoto learned about a specific investigation into a specific person, and had that inspired him to write due notice to the FBI? No spoilers, it's in my book, but the FBI failed, and for a pretty stupid reason. And at the risk of sounding self-aggrandizing, I can tell you that I found what the FBI did not. The answer is deep inside of Bernard DeVoto's archive at Stanford University. And when I first started looking into this, whether I could find the thing that the FBI did not, did a specific person inspire Bernard DeVoto to write this column, I thought if I was able to, that it would turn out to be a Harvard professor or another neighbor of the DeVotos in Cambridge. So I was shocked that it turned out to be a gentleman who lived in my hometown, Missoula, Montana. This is Roald Peterson. He worked for the U.S. Forest Service. His job was regulating grazing ranges. This is exactly the type of conservation professional that Pat McCarron wanted to drive out of a job. And I found this story out because I was able to track down one of Roald's granddaughters who's still alive. And she told me a story that had been passed down for 70 years by her late mother. And I was able to use that to find documents in the Montana Historical Society and in Roald Peterson's FBI file that corroborated the whole thing. What happened was in 1949, 2 anonymous FBI informants accused Roald of having once been a communist. They were wrong. At best, they were mistaken. At worst, they were malicious. But because he was accused, he had to undergo a loyalty investigation. If any of you saw the film Oppenheimer, you know what loyalty investigations could be like. And despite the fact that Montanans of every political stripe by the dozen came out and spoke in Roald's defense, this whole ordeal was hell on his family. Roald had married a woman from the New Orleans area, and while he was being investigated, she suffered a psychotic break, and her sister would have her committed to what was then unfortunately known as the East Louisiana Asylum for the Insane. And while she was on her way there, she talked to a man in New Orleans who decided to also inform to the FBI on his impression of a conversation that he had with a soon-to-be ex-spouse who was on her way to a literal insane asylum. This is a source that Hoover found credible. That man told the FBI that it sounded to him like Roald was, quote, behaving like a homosexual. This is in Roald Peterson's FBI file. This came at a time, mind you, when Joe McCarthy was going across America saying he was out to expose all communists and queers, which was high irony, because working for McCarthy, as he had just worked for Pat McCarron, was the infamous attorney Roy Cohn, a closeted gay man who was in love with the gentleman sitting on the other side of Joe McCarthy, G. David Schein. But for Americans not as politically connected as Roy Cohn, it could be tragic. Based on that new false allegation, Roald was investigated again. And this time he was fired from the U.S. Forest Service. And because of that, he lost his family's ranch in Montana's Bitterroot Valley. If any of you have seen the show Yellowstone, the place that they filmed, that they have cast as the Dutton Home Ranch, that actual property is in Montana's Bitterroot Valley. Roald lived not too far away. That's an example of what was taken from him. A judge deciding custody of the kids between an institutionalized mom and an accused dad put the kids into foster care, and they were sexually abused. And the two youngest ones eventually committed suicide. This is the human cost of McCarthyism. And something not dissimilar happened to another conservation ally of Bernard DeVoto's. This is Wyoming Senator Lester Hunt. His son was arrested in Washington, D.C. on suspicion of being gay, and two of McCarron and McCarthy's Senate allies blackmailed Senator Hunt and told him that if he did not resign, that Joe McCarthy was going to go to Wyoming and make a campaign issue out of his son's arrest. This came 45 years before the brutal murder of gay University of Wyoming student Matthew Shepard. We have all seen some of Senator Hunt's legacy. He's the guy that chose this to be the emblem of the state of Wyoming, the buckaroo on the Bronco. What Bernard DeVoto could see was that a pattern had emerged, that people who stood between Pat McCarron and his designs to grab resources on public lands, those people found themselves investigated, targeted, harassed, smeared, persecuted. And come the 1950s, Pat McCarron had a new way to literally funnel public wealth from public lands to his Western cronies. Dams. Multi-million-dollar dams. Dams are an incredibly complex conservation issue. They make life possible for millions of people in the West. They do terrible ecological damage and waste a lot of water. But whatever balance of nature remained was at risk of being permanently overturned, because by the 1950s, so many dams had been built that some of the only places left where dams could be built were inside national parks. Because in order to build a dam, you have to have a canyon. And so once again, Pat McCarron used his power on Senate appropriations committees. He withheld money from the National Park Service so that it could not defend itself, and he poured hundreds of millions of dollars into the two big dam building agencies, the Army Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation. And so, empowered by McCarron, those agencies drew up plans to build dams either inside of or close enough to flood out significant portions of national park units, including the Grand Canyon in Arizona and Yellowstone in Wyoming, Glacier National Park in Montana, Kings Canyon National Park in California, Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky. This wasn't just a Western issue. Fort Donelson National Battlefield in Tennessee. But the first guillotine blade to fall, the first domino to drop, was going to be a dam built here in the middle of Dinosaur National Monument, which straddles Colorado and Bernard DeVoto's home state of Utah. If a dam could be built inside Dinosaur National Monument, that would give a green light for all these other dam plans to move forward. And if America could not protect its national parks, its best known and most beloved public lands, no other acre of public land stood a chance against being exploited and liquidated. And Bernard DeVoto knew what he had to do. He had done it before. He would write another blockbuster, only he wanted this one to reach even more eyeballs than Harper's Magazine. So he put it in the biggest and best read news magazine of his era, the Saturday Evening Post. And he gave it another attention-grabbing headline: "Shall we let them ruin our national parks?" That's Dinosaur National Monument in the background. This 1950 article let the American people know the threat that dams posed to national parks and public lands. And what happened when Bernard DeVoto let the American people know about yet more malfeasance that ultimately Nevada Senator Pat McCarron was behind? Well, it got Bernard DeVoto attacked coast to coast by Pat McCarron's understudy, Joe McCarthy. This is a scoop. In the lead up to the 1952 presidential election, the person who Joe McCarthy himself attacked most conspicuously often and most viciously was public lands journalist Bernard DeVoto. However, it being Joe McCarthy, not exactly a stickler for accuracy or facts, when he went on nationwide TV to tell America to worry about Bernard DeVoto, he called him, this is the audio portion of the presentation,
Richard DeVoto.
In case you couldn't quite make that out, that is Joe McCarthy calling Bernard DeVoto Richard DeVoto. McCarthy wasn't done. He began to attack magazines that published Bernard DeVoto, and he began to get blacklisted from the Saturday Evening Post and Reader's Digest and Fortune magazine. This was a crisis for conservation because the DeVotos were the most important spokespeople of their era for public lands conservation. It was also a crisis for the DeVoto family because this was their livelihood. Fortunately, Bernard had Avis, and Avis had Bernard, and they began collaborating more closely than ever before, brainstorming new and alternative story ideas that Bernard could pitch and write, often under a pseudonym. He did a lot of work for Woman's Day magazine in this era, things he could write to compensate for his getting blacklisted. Avis, who, remember, loves cooking, she suggested that Bernard DeVoto write about kitchen knives, and he did under his own name in Harper's Magazine. And in early 1952, that got him a fan letter from a new friend and ally, Julia Child. One of the things that Avis did for Bernard was she answered a lot of his fan mail. So Avis wrote Julia back, Julia wrote Avis back, and they discovered they had such incredible chemistry that they became best friends for the rest of their lives. And Julia confided her dream to Avis DeVoto. Julia said she dreamed of writing an encyclopedic cookbook of French recipes. And Avis, who, remember, ever since she was a little girl, she was fascinated with food and with cooking. She was so inspired and excited by this idea from this then unknown Julia Child that she made a promise. She promised she would use Bernard DeVoto's connections in the publishing industry to get Julia Child a breakout book deal. This friendship came into the DeVotos' lives at a real low point in their fight for our public lands, and because it meant so much to the DeVotos, and because this is kind of a show and tell format, I was hoping I could beg your indulgence to give you a taste, if you'll pardon the pun, of some of the depth of love and emotion that was part of this great friendship. The Childs added the DeVotos to a select group of dear friends to whom they would always send handmade valentines. Paul Child was a very talented artist, and these cards that he made could sometimes be whimsical, like this funny Victorian-looking scene. Sometimes they could be risque. Here's Paul and Julia in the bathtub. Sometimes they could be very ornate. This Valentine that Paul hand-painted looks like it could be a stained glass window. Sometimes Paul's composition could be risque. This was a photo that Julia took of him painting en plein air, shall we say. This is a poem that Paul wrote on the back of that last Valentine, and you'll notice that the first letter of each line from top to bottom spells to Avis and Bernard. This is Julia Child's kitchen in France in 1953, up on the shelf where you might expect to see a cookbook. Instead, you see The Course of Empire by Bernard DeVoto. This is a collection of cards of organizations that Bernard was a member of. There's the ones you would expect. There's his National Parks Lifetime Pass, his Sierra Club membership card, his membership in the Outdoor Writers Association of America. And up in the top corner is his official honorary membership in the L'École des Trois Gourmands, the cooking school that Julia Child taught in France. This friendship between the DeVotos and the Childs, particularly between Avis DeVoto and Julia Child, it's very famous. It should be. They have a collection of letters and an archive at Harvard University. They're wonderful. The friendship has been in books. It's been on TV shows. It's been in a hit movie. What people don't realize about this extraordinary friendship is that it came together because of the DeVotos' McCarthy-era fight to save our national parks and public lands. And the Childs weren't the only new friend and ally to come into the DeVotos' lives because of their conservation crusade. I'll let this logger in Montana's Bitterroot Mountains introduce the next one. He says, "I'll be goddamned, I never thought I'd meet Adlai Stevenson here." Adlai Stevenson was the Democratic nominee for president in 1952 and 1956, and in 54, he asked DeVoto to meet him in secret in Missoula, Montana, to give him a field lesson in conservation. So DeVoto brought him into the Bitterroot Mountains and taught him about chain smoking. I'm joking. He taught him about his passion, rangeland health. Grass holds the soil. Friends, this is grassroots politics. And Stevenson begins to get the DeVoto public lands philosophy. Someone's left a sloppy campsite and he yells out, "Clean it up, you son of a bitch." But DeVoto impresses on Stevenson that the number one reason for public lands conservation is to protect the sources of clean, cold water, which is the lifeblood of the West, and which Stevenson goes fly fishing for cutthroat trout in. If Stevenson is elected president, Bernard DeVoto is probably going to be either his Secretary of Interior or Secretary of Agriculture, but DeVoto is thinking ahead just in case Stevenson is not the guy to get his conservation ideas into the White House. DeVoto is also keeping up a robust conservation correspondence with his senator in Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy. But that's all in the future. Come 1955, the crisis for conservation in America is this river, the Green River, and whether a dam is going to be built on it inside Dinosaur National Monument, taking a landscape that looks like this and making it look about like this. And the American people don't want this. Letters to members of Congress about this proposed dam are 80-1 against it. But the dam still has all the momentum it needs to get built because nobody machinates minority power in government better than Nevada Senator Pat McCarron, who is simultaneously marshaling all the cultural power of McCarthyism. People who oppose this dam get called weak and communist and gay. As the dam was being debated in Congress, Paul Child got subjected to a loyalty investigation. Paul Child was accused of being gay, despite all the documentary evidence he could provide to the contrary. Avis DeVoto, for the rest of her life, would believe that Paul Child being investigated in that way at that time was somehow retribution for the Childs being such conservation allies of the DeVotos. And it all took a heavy psychic strain on Bernard DeVoto. All the worry for his country, meaning the public lands of the West, all the worry for his country, meaning the United States. DeVoto wrote, "If our wilderness is destroyed, how in 100 years would anybody know what wonders there were in this America of ours?" When he was at his lowest in 1955, he got another one of these opportunities that he always tried to capitalize on. He was asked to come to New York City and be on a CBS TV show and tell the story of Mesa Verde National Park. Mesa Verde in southwest Colorado is a homeland of the ancestral Puebloan people. The ancestral Puebloans irrigated farmland, they built towns, they built cities. The ancestral Puebloans built the tallest skyscrapers in North America until Chicago in the 1880s. And tree rings tell the story that around the year 1200, centuries before Columbus, the climate warmed a little bit and mega droughts struck, and the ancestral Puebloans abandoned their farms and their towns and their cities, and they vanished. And DeVoto believed that a parable about a civilization in the American West that didn't conserve its water, that vanished, that would change public opinion about dam building toward caution and conservation and preservation. And DeVoto wanted to put everything that he had into this broadcast, all his growing up in the West, all his reading about the West, all his traveling around the West, all his writing about the West, all his learning about the West, all his talking to Westerners, all his bringing new allies into the West, like this gentleman in the white hat, that is book publisher Alfred Knopf. Remember him? He wanted the broadcast infused with the spirit of all the cigarettes that he smoked in the West and all the horsing around and the fun he had with his friends in the U.S. Forest Service. Friends, this is the part in my talk when I have to apologize to you because I am not clever enough to have figured out a way to get around having to tell you here that Bernard DeVoto doesn't make it. He dies right after that broadcast, November 13th, 1955. But had he lived until the end of that month, he would have seen headlines like this all over America. A victory for Bernard DeVoto. Because of the coalition that he built and led, he convinced the Eisenhower administration to reverse itself and to not build a dam, inside Dinosaur National Monument. There we go. This upheld the sanctity of the National Park Service. This upheld the precedent of not exploiting and liquidating every acre of federally protected land, public and tribal. The credit should certainly go to Bernard DeVoto, but it should equally go to Avis, because without Avis, there never would have been Bernard. And when he died at the age of 58, Avis was only 51, and she was devastated, because not only had she lost her romantic partner of 3 decades, she also lost her professional partner. The professional skills that Avis lent to Bernard were editing and idea generating and proofreading and fan mail answering. Fortunately, when Avis was at her lowest, she had one of America's great best friends. When Julia Child learned the news, she rushed a plane ticket to Avis DeVoto, and she brought Avis to Europe. And Julia spent weeks cooking for Avis and caring for Avis and nurturing Avis. And Julia set Avis's heart on the path toward healing. And eventually, Avis realized that though she could never in her life have another romantic partner, she could have another professional partner. And so Avis DeVoto transferred to Julia Child all the professional skills that she had lent to Bernard DeVoto, editing and idea generating and proofreading and indexing. Avis DeVoto was the only person who Julia Child deputized to answer her fan mail. And Avis kept that promise that she made to Julia Child when they first met over a letter more than a decade before. Avis did use Bernard DeVoto's contacts in the publishing industry to get her a breakout book deal. Mastering the Art of French Cooking, Volumes 1 and 2 were published by Alfred Knopf. Through this presentation, I've been able to show you a little bit of film of Bernard DeVoto from a home movie I found that had been moldering in an archive for 7 decades. I was never able to find any footage of Avis. And so the closest I can come to showing you what animate Avis looked like comes from the silver screen and fair use laws. This is Deborah Rush as Avis DeVoto opposite Meryl Streep as Julia Child in the 2009 movie Julie and Julia. Right now on HBO Max is a series called Julia that stars Bebe Neuwirth as Avis DeVoto. This is one of the great friendships in American history. This is a friendship that came together because of the DeVotos' McCarthy-era fight to save our national parks and public lands. When Avis grew elderly, she joined with other women in her adopted hometown of Cambridge, Massachusetts, and they got this park built. This is JFK Memorial Park. For her efforts in 1984, the Cambridge City Council voted unanimously to honor Avis by etching her name into Harvard Square. So today, a ledge at the corner of Mount Auburn and Brattle Streets reads, "Bernard and Avis DeVoto, Friends of Cambridge Conservation." Although Bernard had been dead for 3 decades, Avis still wanted him right beside her. But of course, that's not the only place where the DeVotos are publicly honored. There's also the DeVoto Memorial Cedar Grove atop the Bitterroot Mountains inside the Clearwater National Forest. That grove was dedicated in September 1962. That's the DeVoto's friend and source in the Forest Service, Chet Olson, speaking at the dedication ceremony. The person who escorted Avis to the ceremony was Montana Senator Lee Metcalf, born at the base of those mountains. There they are on the front of my hometown newspaper, the Missoulian. And at the dedication ceremony, Senator Metcalf read aloud a special message from President Kennedy. And Kennedy began by honoring Avis. And he went on to talk about how he had been inspired by Bernard DeVoto. And Avis would write Kennedy back. She would also visit the DeVoto Memorial Cedar Grove one more time. When Bernard DeVoto died, Avis arranged for his ashes to be spread over the Clearwater National Forest from a smoke jumper plane. And when Avis died, her son Mark, pictured with her there at the dedication ceremony, he took her ashes to the DeVoto Memorial Cedar Grove and scattered them. Mark spiritually and literally brought his parents, Bernard and Avis DeVoto, back together again. In that September 1962 thank you that Avis wrote to President Kennedy, she offered him some advice. because Avis was daring like that. She would offer unsolicited advice to the President of the United States. Avis advised that one day Kennedy should visit the DeVoto Memorial Cedar Grove. She told him that although there were more scenically awesome places in America, she had never found another place that was simultaneously so peaceful and so majestic. We know Kennedy never got a chance to take Avis up on that advice, but I feel like it's good advice to wind this talk down with. If you are ever fortunate enough to be traveling Highway 12 near the border of Montana and Idaho, over the Bitterroot Mountains, through the Clearwater National Forest, you should stop at the DeVoto Memorial Cedar Grove. Because of public lands conservation, you'll find that it is still everything that Avis said it was. And even if you're not able to stop, even if all you can do is take note of the sign as you pass by, now you know. There's a pretty interesting story there. Thank you so much, everybody. I am so grateful to be here. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.